Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this world of ours. I hope you're safe and well. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of conversations on issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today, I'm pleased to welcome back to the program a friend and colleague of some 40 years, David M. Satterfield. David is one of the finest analysts of the contemporary Middle East and a stunningly lucid and clear thinker, and he's had a remarkable career. He now serves as the director of the Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, where he has the added advantage of a lot of contact with the inestimable former Secretary of State, for whom we both worked, James Addison Baker. David has served as an Assistant Secretary of State, National Security Council Staff Director, Ambassador to both Lebanon, Turkey, Charge d'Affaires in Iraq and Egypt. In October 2023, President Biden appointed David as the White House Special Envoy for Middle East Humanitarian Issues to lead U.S. diplomacy in addressing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. David served for many months in that extraordinarily important capacity. In April of this year, he stepped down from that role, but he continues to serve as a trusted advisor and consultant to the Department of State and to the White House. I want to take advantage of the 40 plus minutes we have to have a strategic conversation with David about the Israel-Hamas war. And I wanted to start, David, and welcome to Carnegie Connects. It's great to see you, as always. I wanted to start with a question. Our friend and colleague, CIA Director Bill Burns, described the Israel-Gaza war. Rarely, he said, has he seen the Middle East more tangled or explosive. You and I have weathered many Israeli-Lebanese confrontations, Israeli-Palestinian confrontations, a series of tensions, confrontations, wars in the region. Why is this one so much more complicated than what we've experienced in the past?
Well, Bill's comments are absolutely on point. This is the most complex challenge in terms of coming up with a cogent, achievable resolution set that I've seen in 45 years. And there are many reasons for that. Look, we faced very significant challenges in Iraq. We have in other areas of the Middle East that were, in terms of the demographics, the dynamics, the involvement of external parties, far broader than Gaza. But Gaza presents uniquely a confined area, 2.2 million people, an urban population essentially, that can't leave. You can't do what we did in Mosul and evacuate 1.5 million people where we could provide for their welfare while a campaign against ISIS went on in the town. The Gazans have nowhere to go. They have to stay in Gaza. Why is that? Because no one, not Egypt, not Israel, the government of Israel, and certainly not us or the Arab states, want to see Palestinians displaced out of Gaza, because the fear would be, once displaced, they could not return. So they have to stay there. But within the very narrow, we're talking about a place the size essentially of sub-Delaware, somewhere between the District of Columbia and Delaware. You've got these millions of people who, in the course of the fighting since October 7th, have been displaced multiple times. Right now, 90% of the entire population has been displaced at least once, most of them 3 or 4 times. That adds to the humanitarian burden for shelter, for sanitation, for medical care, for feeding. It's a problem that has existed since the beginning of the campaign in the north, with the evacuation of over 1 million people under Israeli orders to the south. It has been exacerbated by repeated redisplacements within the center and the south. That's what creates the humanitarian challenge we face. But let's go on now to the security dimensions here. You have a campaign which is absolutely unique in both Israeli and U.S. experience, indeed for any modern army. You're fighting above ground, you're fighting below ground. You had, at the beginning, over 200 hostages, held locations uncertain. You have right now 120 hostages still held, many of them living, many sadly passed. But all of this, the unique character of the above and below ground campaign, make this challenging for any military. Now we'll add the unexpected. When the campaign began after the brutal massacre of October 7th, and Aaron, let's remind ourselves, because we have to yet again, this was the most significant murder of Jews since the camps were liberated in 45. And if you miss that point or it's obscured, then you really don't get the strategic context in which all of this is happening. But when the Israelis responded to that massacre, as they had every obligation, not just right, to do, they encountered a Hamas which was far different from the one they and we assessed existed. This wasn't a terrorist gang with disconnected fighters or militia. It was a terrorist army, 30,000 plus strong, heavily armed, deeply embedded in a tunnel network about which we knew, anecdotally, episodically. We were aware for years of tunnels under major humanitarian structures, including hospitals. We had no idea the extent of the tunnel network, 300 miles of tunnels, and tunnels built not in Great Escape movie fashion with spoons and shovels, but extraordinarily well connected, reinforced, and deep enough to be beyond the range of any penetrators, any ordnance which Israel we possess at the deepest points. All of this has made this campaign extraordinarily difficult. Hamas has been exceptionally resilient. Israel has indeed killed, taken off the battlefield, disrupted, degraded Hamas's military capacities, as the president has spoken to. They don't have the ability right now to do what they did on October 7th, but they remain a de facto force of influence on the ground. And as we go on with this discussion, we'll talk about what that means. This is a very, very hard fight, harder than anyone could have imagined when the president on October 18th visited Israel and he said, "I'm with you. I've got your back. You got every obligation to do this. But you're going to need time and you're going to need space." Now, the president was right. We didn't know, any of us, how right he was at that moment. More time, more space is absolutely required here.
You know, David, it's been one of my seminal understandings. It's taken me a long time to fully grasp this, that if you want to fix the world, you first have to understand it. And I've been struck over the last almost 9 months, next month, by the lack of leverage and influence that outside parties have on this conflict. It's almost as if it's a history lesson in the fact that the Middle East is literally littered with the remains of great powers who thought wrongly they could impose their schemes, their dreams, their ambitions on smaller ones. What is it, in your judgment, about, and we'll get to the U.S.-Israel relationship in a minute, what is it that outside actors don't understand with respect to this conflict? Is it the fact that in a conflict in which the stakes are perceived to be existential or near existential, that it's structurally important? It's just a reality that the influence of outsiders is going to be drastically limited in altering their calculations?
You hit it right on the head, Aaron. It is that this is for Hamas, for Israel, an existential or perceived, which amounts to the same thing, crisis. Israel is a traumatized society. It is a society where over 100,000 people cannot live in their homes for these 9 months now in the north. And we've got to talk about the north as well, because that's another significant factor. But in the Gaza corridor, it's a society with 120 hostages still left in Hamas's hands. Remains are living. It's a society where the images of what happened on October 7th are still seared into the national psyche. That's not a political judgment. It's a social, it's a psychological judgment. This is existential. And the fear that looms over Israel, whatever the political identity of the individual might be, is that at the end of all of this, will Israel and Israelis be able to live what Bill Clinton called a life reflecting the quiet miracle of normality? That's the challenge here. For Hamas, this is existential as well. Hamas sees what happened and what has happened since October 7th as absolutely contributing to their ultimate goal, which has nothing to do with Gaza. Gaza is purely an instrumentality for Hamas, always has been. Their goal is first, Ramallah and the West Bank and the PLO, displacing Fatah for good as the head of the Palestinian movement. But beyond that, every Arab street, particularly in the Gulf, where they wish to be seen as the holders of the banner of Palestinian national cause, Palestinian resistance. That's what makes this all, for both Israel and Hamas, near or actually an existential conflict. And in those circumstances, it isn't dealing with 73, where you had state parties with resolution sets and interim arrangements that presented themselves where all sides saw an interest in agreeing. This is a fundamental clash of interests where any kind of calculus that works for all the parties involved, and one of those parties is a vicious terrorist organization, is very, very difficult to contemplate.
Yeah. I would only add to the complexity that on the Israeli political side is that you have an Israeli government now without Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot. Again, the most extreme right-wing government in Israel's history, led by a prime minister who seems to have conflated his own determination to stay in power with what he conceives to be the best interests of his country, which is an unfortunate set of circumstances. But I don't expect, and I'm not going to press you to deal with the Israeli political side of this. But I will ask you the question on the U.S.-Israel relationship, because I am stunned. Again, next month is 9 months. In 9 months, the Biden administration has been reluctant to, unwilling, unable, refused, whatever transitive or intransitive verb you want to attach, to impose a single cost or consequence on policies that it clearly objects to, that normal humans like you and I would consider sustained or serious pressure. I'm asked this question all the time. Why? And I have my own answer. I've spoken and written about it. Is it the president's emotional commitment to Israel, his persona? Is it the domestic politics? What is it, in your view, that has constrained the administration from using any of the leverage that it clearly has to alter, adjust, push forward its own sort of vision and tactics and strategy toward managing and ultimately ending the Israel-Hamas war? What is it, David?
Well, Aaron, before I get to the what is it, let's talk about what we have been able to do. Had we not exerted the day and night, every day of the week after week, month after month, influence at the highest levels of our government, the President of the United States on the phone, Jake Sullivan, Secretary Blinken, trying to work both humanitarian issues, deconfliction, coordination, which did have a military kinetic character to all of it, you wouldn't have gone from zero on October 20th, not one drop of fuel, water, not an ounce of food moving in, to where we were on May 6th, which was hundreds of trucks moving every day to the north, to the center, to the south. That was the product of what we did. It was our leadership. It was our work. And you know, something your watchers may be interested in, Jack Lew, our extraordinary ambassador to Israel, and I would reflect at 3 or 4 in the morning Israel time on how our career arcs had led us. In Jack's case, Secretary of Treasury, twice Director of OMB, Chief of Staff, to being truck managers. But then we reminded ourselves the president was doing this as well because we had to. So let's not diminish what our influence and leadership did do. But I will now come to your question. I believe profoundly it is the president's understanding beyond politics or advisors or factors that this is a conflict where Israel has to be supported, where what happened was so horrific, this vicious act of murder of Israelis, of Jew killings by a radical Islamist terrorist group, that not to support Israel, not to provide what they needed to pursue a fight, an ultimate outcome in which Hamas could not do what its own spokesperson said would be repeat this October 7th again and again and again, that there was no other conscionable outcome. I think it is rooted fundamentally in the president's belief that this is the right thing to do.
I mean, politically, I think the argument holds up, given the fact that who knows what will be on the minds of American voters on November 5th. Anything in an election could be determined by, 3 states and under 100,000 voters could matter. And this could matter as well. And I think the president on this one I think you're right. It may not make people happy. Some people think that foreign policy needs to be completely separated from the sensibilities and the views and the biases and the prejudgments, the prejudices of presidents. But then again, every president brings to the office a set of aspirations and biases. And in this case, I do believe that you're right. It's the president's persona above politics in this case. I want to get, though, to the issue of policy now. Am I wrong to believe that the administration's calculation that the only way to end this war would be through, or at least to begin to de-escalate it and perhaps build on it if they could create some sort of foundation? The only way to de-escalate this war and ultimately to terminate it would be in an Israeli-Hamas deal, which frees hostages for an undetermined number of Palestinian prisoners, allows aid to surge into Gaza in a reliable and predictable manner, and buys yourself 6 weeks of a ceasefire, which Gaza has not experienced since October 7th. How much of the policy was tethered to the fact that they needed the assent, obviously not only of Hamas, but of Israel as well? How much is that practical policy choice a function of the way the administration has behaved? And where are we now, would you suggest, with respect to the Israeli, and I'll say it 10 times, the Israeli proposal that the president articulated on May 31st?
Aaron, the theory of the case is indeed that a hostage release, a multi-phased hostage release, which would result ultimately in accountability for all of the Israelis taken, that would be accompanied by a ceasefire of a prolonged and prolongable duration, would have the effect of doing 2 things. First, getting the hostages back. And remind yourselves, there are 5 Americans in that group as well, about which the president must be and is concerned. It gets the hostages back. It achieves a ceasefire which will facilitate enormously the ability to get humanitarian assistance of all types to the very, very deserving and suffering people of Gaza. It will do all of that. It's when you get to the and then what's. So you've got a ceasefire, you've got a better humanitarian situation in terms of getting aid in. You've depressurized the social space a bit because those hostages are accounted for now. Loved ones are back with their families, or families know the fate of their loved ones if they've perished. But where do you go from there? And that is where the most difficult issue in this conflict stands. What's the end state? Not the interim process. But
Right.
Look, we focus always on the art of the practical and the doable. And that art of the practical and the doable has to focus right now on ceasefire/hostage return. And you're right, the Israeli proposal is, as the president, as the secretary, as Jake have said, an extraordinarily flexible and forthcoming one. And I'll quote the secretary's words from Europe from just a few days ago. If Hamas continues to prevaricate, his words, if it continues to throw up new conditions, replacing things it accepted in the past, then reasonable actors must reach decisions about whether Hamas in fact wants a deal. I have my thoughts on that, which is they don't. That attrition, just as with Putin in Ukraine, for Yahya Sinwar down there in the tunnels, Sinwar doesn't think he's going to be martyred. Sinwar thinks he's going to win this. He wins it by surviving. And attrition of international support for Israel, domestic politics in Israel, U.S. support for Israel. That's his calculus. That's his strategy. Why should he accept a deal right now? But even if that is our assumption, it is critical as diplomats that we continue to advance it as a possibility.
You and I have talked about 2024 being the year of Gaza. Time here is not well, for Sinwar and Prime Minister Netanyahu, time may well be an ally for the Biden administration, for the hostages, for the 2.23 million Palestinians of Gaza, hostage families. Time is an adversary. It's an enemy. It's June already. In another several months, we're going to end up focusing, public will, more on our November elections. If you could sketch out a realistic, hopeful outcome between now and end of year, an outcome not tethered to a galaxy far, far away, but tethered to the realities back on planet Earth. We'll get to perhaps the more likely outcomes, but aspirationally, Dave, that's something that's real. How would you sketch out a hopeful ending by year's end?
Well, Aaron, I struggle internally with the juxtaposition of hopeful and realistic, but I will try to respond to your question. It is very much what Israel has proposed, what the Security Council, by an exceptional 14-0 Russian abstention vote, endorsed. An almost unique circumstance in my half century of doing this, and yours.
It is unique.
Yeah.
No Security Council resolution has ever 14-0 with one abstention adopted any Israeli proposal, probably on anything. But go ahead.
But it is that proposal being accepted in its essential elements by Hamas. It is the actual execution, the return of hostages, of remains, accounting for all of those taken from their homes. It is a ceasefire which allows a significant and sustained improvement in the humanitarian situation in Gaza. And it is something else. It is possibly a further opening towards what the administration, in my view, quite rightly, regards as the strategic frame for everything it's trying to do, which is not focused myopically, important as it is, on Gaza, but on the region as a whole, and on the strategic challenges to the region, which are posed by, right now, two states, the PRC and Iran. The whole Saudi deal, about which so much commentary has been made, and in my view, commentary that in many cases is misguided or misplaced. This is about strategic issues. It is about de-risking Saudi Arabia from Iranian threat. It is about de-risking American interests from Chinese further penetration, presence, commercially, in a security sense, in the Middle East. That's the big strategic goal. Gaza needs a form of resolution in order to permit those broader U.S. strategic interests, and I'll underscore that, U.S. strategic interests, which will persist well beyond the life of this or any other successor administration, permits them to be advanced or at least mitigated in terms of harm. That's why what we're trying to do is so important, both on the broader regional front as well as on Gaza. Do I think by the end of the year, we will be able to work our way through to progress both on Gaza and on that broader regional issue? Gaza first, we've got to make every effort to do it. It's why our good friend Bill has been out as often as he has, leading with Qatar, with Egypt, these efforts. And it's why they've got to continue until it is clear there is no future for them. And we're not at that point yet.
But now, I won't say more likely, let's just objectively talk about potential outcomes that are much less hopeful.
Yeah. Aaron, look, as you talked about, many decades of working this issue, Israel-Palestine, Gaza in specific, I find it difficult to be optimistic about days after. And I'll tell you why. The character of the Hamas presence in Gaza, what Hamas built in those years that followed 2006, the elections, 2007, the Hamas coup that expelled Fatah and the Palestinian Authority, is extraordinary in terms of the security network they have. Look at how Israel has had to deal again and again and again with resurgence of Hamas demonstrations of practical control of security threat, not just rocketing, but presence on the ground in the north, in Khan Yunis. These were the parts of Gaza that were most intensively the objects of ground maneuver campaigns. And yet Israel has had to return again and again and again to the north, as well as to Khan Yunis and the central camp area where it's operating now. Because Israel understands profoundly, it isn't a U.S. assessment, that Hamas's persistent ability to demonstrate passively or actively when it needs and wants that it is the controlling force on the ground presents a challenge to Israel, and we'll go beyond Israel in a moment, but a challenge to Israel that is extraordinarily difficult to resolve. Now, let's look at resolution sets as they've been contemplated for that day after. Stabilization or monitoring force for Gaza, made up primarily of Arab states. Ultimately, reconstruction in Gaza, funded by the international community, but again by Arab states in a significant fashion. We have to ask ourselves, if Hamas is capable, as they are right now, of exercising, when they choose, situational dominance on the ground, which can mean challenging something they don't want, being passive when things that they do want are happening. Are you going to get Arab boots, Arab shoes on the ground? Is any Arab government going to have its forces monitoring or stabilization, as they may be described, shoot Palestinians? I don't think so. And will the Emirates, will Saudi Arabia put their dollars, their rials, their dinars into reconstruction in a situation where that reconstruction is seen, A, as potentially benefiting Hamas, but B, the potential target of further Israeli actions when Israel responds to a Hamas threat? Again, history would tell us the answer is unlikely to be yes. And this is where I face the most profound question marks. How do you achieve any form of day after that is not one of several options, all unacceptable? A return to Israeli occupation, de facto, a Somalia-like situation, generalized chaos, radicalization, violence, extraordinary humanitarian suffering, or an acceptance de facto that Hamas is still there and has a vote, if not the vote, in deciding what goes on. Look at the micro issue, if you will, for the moment, of Rafah and reopening Rafah terminal. There are many issues involved in restoring operation, including the position of the Israeli government, the Israeli coalition, against bringing the PA formally as such into operation of the terminal. But let's look beyond that. and this is an issue that I worked many years ago, when Mahmoud Abbas refused to put PA officials, when that's very much what Israel and we and Egypt wanted, into the Rafah terminal, because he said all they're going to be are fronts for Hamas. Hamas will do what it wants, but we, the PA, will be blamed for what happens. I'm not going to do it. Well, a lot has changed since then, but some things haven't. I think the PA will be very reluctant to re-engage in operations in Gaza when they are seen as under the de facto shadow of threat of Hamas.
Right. So 9 months in, almost next month, it seems as if Hamas's capacity, obviously not as an organized military structure, capable of mounting a military style organized terror attack, will survive as an insurgency at a minimum. And you saw that day before yesterday in Rafah, which was the single deadliest day for the Israelis since January. Or alternatively, because of the weakness of the Palestinian national movement, the Palestinian Authority, as a relevant political force that will exert its influence through intimidation or even co-optation. So you could imagine, Dave, a situation, I know folks said October 7, everything's going to be different. Middle East is going to change. This was another purported transformation that was going to change everything. And it hasn't. It's conceivable then you could imagine a Gaza which is a variant of October 6 or before October 6, with the Israelis operating, not with large ground scale maneuvers, but operating against pockets of Hamas activity, with no Palestinian governing structure, perhaps left to Hamas civil officials whose salaries are still being paid, presumably by the Palestinian Authority, no Arab boots on the ground, and a sort of sporadic international effort to deliver humanitarian aid. Can we even talk about reconstruction? Is it
No,
that gloomy, Dave?
Aaron, I think it has many of the gloomy aspects of what you presented. But I'll add another one. It isn't October 6th, and it can't be October 6th again in terms of the physical state of Gaza. Recall, by most credible estimates, 60, 70% of all habitable, usable spaces, structures in Gaza have been destroyed, not damaged, destroyed. The infrastructure fundamentally damaged and destroyed. That's not October 6th. That's a different situation entirely. And that's the situation that's going to be the frame for whatever else happens on the ground. The other point I would challenge is episodic international commitment to humanitarian assistance. I don't think it will be episodic. I think there will remain a robust international commitment to getting assistance in. But the other dimensions, in terms of Hamas presence, in terms of Israel striking, acting, operating, not just from the air, but on the ground, when it is posed a security threat, absolutely. I think those are indeed the most likely cases. And I do not see reconstruction as a likely outcome if, in fact, that is where things wind up. And I'll make a point here that looks again beyond Israel, beyond the Palestinians, at the Arab world in general. And I've made this comment many times in the past. What's the real fear on the part of virtually every government in North Africa, the peninsula, the Middle East? The images of killed Palestinians are gut-wrenching. They are there, they are here for us. And I don't dismiss that. But the real fear is that Israel, the state of Israel, the IDF, will have done everything in its power to diminish, to break Hamas, and it will not have succeeded. And it will be visibly seen on the street as not succeeding. That is a profound shock and threat for the Arab world. Why? Because the last thing they want is for Hamas, like Hezbollah in Lebanon, to what in Arabic is on the Hezbollah banners, فَأَنَّنَا غَالِبُونَ, for we are the victors. That will have a strategic and negative strategic impact throughout the Arab region, and it will have a negative impact on U.S. interests because it will be instrumentalized, as it is being instrumentalized today, by Iran and by others who act in a manner that is deeply threatening and strategically threatening to the U.S.
I want to, we have some time left. I want to turn now from war termination to containment. You and I have worked the Lebanon issue since the 80s during an unfortunate period of U.S. involvement, which ended in tragedy. For 18 years, from the summer of 2006 until today, Israel and Hezbollah have avoided a major escalation that could easily trip into a regional confrontation. Risk aversion has prevailed, presumably, for 18 years. Is it your assessment that somehow a way can be managed to avoid a major escalation where Hezbollah would draw on its arsenal of scores of thousands of high trajectory weapons of varying ranges and precisions, and the Israelis would avoid a massive set of strikes against Lebanese infrastructure, Hezbollah, and unfortunately Lebanese civilians as well?
Yes, Aaron.
Can that be avoided, David?
Yes, and here I am much more hopeful than with respect to Gaza. Let's look at October 7, more importantly, October 8. Sinwar didn't consult with Iran or with Hezbollah when he launched the massacre of October 7th. He mistakenly, and thank heavens for his mistake, assumed that in the aftermath of what his forces perpetrated on the 7th, Iran, Hezbollah, the Arab streets would open up full-blown conflict with Israel. There'd be a war in which he would lead the axis of resistance. That didn't happen. Iran, shocked, froze in place, as did Hezbollah, believing somehow this could be a trap, that if they responded in force, Israel would use that as a pretext to strike them and draw the United States into fundamental bilateral conflict with Iran and Hezbollah as well. Now, that didn't happen. There is no, we, Israel, assess, and have since very shortly after October 7th, there is no strategic intent by Tehran, by Nasrallah, and I would certainly say by Israel, to have a war, a full-blown conflict in the north. The risk in the north is not that. It is misadventure, it's mistake, it's miscalculation. Hezbollah's rocketing drone attacks on northern Israel, which go on not just every day, but every few hours, at times close to 100 such attacks. The north is, in many ways, on fire, the north of Israel. Started in these summer dry conditions by Hezbollah's rockets and drone strikes. You have 80,000 at least Israelis who cannot live in their homes in the north for 9 months because of the continuing attacks. It is at the moment a containable and theoretically indefinitely containable exchange. But the longer it goes on, the greater that risk of mistake, of error, which is why Amos Hochstein is now in Israel today. Why Secretary Austin, why Jake have all been engaged as heavily as they have been with our Lebanese partners, with Israel, in trying to effect a, if not end, at least a diminution, moving towards cessation of the Hezbollah attacks into northern Israel. Now, if there were to be a ceasefire in Gaza, we have every expectation there would be an end to these exchanges in the north. Hezbollah has signaled in the past it would not continue attacks if there was an enduring ceasefire in Gaza. But if there is no ceasefire in Gaza, then Lebanon has to be addressed on its own merits. But here I am hopeful, to go back to my response to you. I do not see the inevitability of a war either with Iran or with Hezbollah, but I see the risk, and a risk that increases with every further Hezbollah strike, of an error in judgment, which leads, despite the intent of either side, to an escalation.
We're almost out of time, and I want to conclude by getting your sense. I suppose it's not maybe it's a philosophical point. I'm desperately trying to look for some measure of hope in all of this. But I also have to be realistic. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict didn't begin on October 7th. Hamas has put the entire population of Gaza at risk. Israel's effort to prosecute this war has had a horrific impact. The exponential rise of Palestinian deaths and casualties, whole families extinguished, the hostage situation. I guess I'm searching now, and this is perhaps an American point. Why is it, do you suppose, David, that it's so hard for people to hold in their hearts and in their minds two traumas? Why is it necessary that we prioritize one trauma over the other? The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not a morality play that pits the forces of goodness on one hand against the forces of darkness on the other. It's a terribly complicated conflict in which both sides have competing needs and requirements. Goethe described a tragedy as competing justices. I think there's much to that. You and I have been doing this for a long time. You continue to do it. Why is it so hard to hold these two traumas and appreciate them despite the asymmetry of power? Maybe it's not possible. We've managed to do it. Why?
Aaron,
Why is one side right and the other wrong? Always.
It's hard for anyone. It's hard in any situation. The U.S. went through this, in many ways is still going through this, with the continuing trauma that enslavement, the Civil War and its outcomes, the civil rights movement have presented. It isn't over for us yet. And maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe it's something that has to be continuously reflected upon, assessed, rectified, mitigated. But for the Middle East, for Israelis, for Palestinians, I'll put Arabs in the broad sense aside in a way that I couldn't have done 10 or 15 or 20 or 25 years ago. But for Israelis and Palestinians, this is still very much a competition of national trauma, of national narrative or narratives, plural, because it's more than one on each side. And it is the perception of zero sum that a gain by one side must require a loss by us. Look, let's go back to the one moment, brief as it was, 93 to 95, the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin, in which the ability to hold at one moment on both sides, both traumas, both narratives, both senses or narratives of grievance, and look to a resolution set, it was there. It was profoundly, psychologically, emotionally difficult. We all recall Yitzhak Rabin. The man was torn apart inside, but he had to make a judgment as to whether the interests of the people of Israel was better served by course A or course B. And he made such a decision. That's a rare moment. It required extraordinary leadership, commitment, and in the end, it was all too brief. But it's possible. It was a demonstration that pragmatic understanding that you can accept, you can hold in your mind the two traumas, the two narratives, the two sets of grievances, and still work towards a resolution because, Rabin's own words, what's the better outcome?
Yeah.
That's tough, very hard.
When this phase ends, my concern and fear is that when Israelis and Palestinians look at one another, they're going to say, it's not that we don't understand one another. It's that we understand one another only too well. And the only anecdote I could see, because it's worked in the past, Dave, is the emergence of leaders on both sides who become masters of their politics, not prisoners of their ideologies, and basically make room in one another's narrative for the pain and suffering of the other, and not in response to any external pressure, come to the conclusion that there's simply been too much suffering. I would have thought after the last 8 or 9 months that we may have reached that point, but I fear we haven't. David, I want to thank you so much for coming back on Carnegie Connects. It's a masterclass in lucidity and clarity and really sharp analysis. Thanks for everything you've done, for everything you're going to do. And please, I would be remiss if I didn't mention, as I do in all of our conversations, please give my very best to the former secretary.
I will indeed. And thank you, Aaron.